Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the CEO of the Churchill Club, Karen Tucker.
Thank you so much. Hello, and welcome everyone. My name is Karen Tucker, and I'm the CEO and a board member here at the Churchill Club. And our event tonight is called Location and Private. We have with us Laura Berger, Jim Dempsey, Brian Knapp, Brendon Lynch, Owen Tripp, and our moderator, Melissa Parrish. Thank you very much for being here, panelists and speakers. Appreciate that. Not only do we have a distinguished panel this evening, we also have an amazing audience, really a who's who of experts and deep thinkers in this topic area, and I want to thank you for your presence, and I hope that many of you will participate in the audience Q&A later on. I also want to recognize California State Senator Joe Simitian, who is with us tonight. And Senator Simitian has been working in this area for a good decade and is very interested in this topic. If you would like to talk with him after the program, I think he'll be around and very willing to speak with you. Our program partner and sponsor is Microsoft Trustworthy Computing. Thank you very much, Microsoft, for your leadership and support in enabling this program. Let's thank Microsoft. Next on the Churchill Club calendar, on February 16, we present a Churchill Club Great Debate. Is software patentable? Should it be? And we have speakers from both sides of that argument. Then on February 24, we have Scott McNeely, the former chairman and CEO of Sun Microsystems, in conversation with Ed Zander, who once was the president of Sun, and as well he was chairman and CEO of Motorola. And they're going to be talking about the legacy of Sun Microsystems, sharing perspectives on where the industry is headed, and they promise it will be a no-holds-barred conversation. Program details can always be found on our website at churchillclub.org. For those of you who are less familiar with the Churchill Club, we are a nonprofit, member-supported, unusually lively business and technology forum with 7,000 members. We are now celebrating our 25th year. If you are not a member already, please do consider joining us. We would appreciate that, and I know that you will enjoy our unique approach to delivering valuable content and connections. Last announcement, you'll find Twitter codes in your printed program. If you are tweeting tonight, please use hashtag Churchill Club. And now let me introduce our moderator. Melissa Parrish is a respected analyst at Forrester Research. She covers social media, technology, organization, and interactive marketing. And her last role as Director of Community Strategy at Time Inc. was created directly as a result of a Forrester analyst's advice to the company. That inspired her a lot, and it influenced her decision to eventually become an analyst herself. Melissa travels a lot, and the location-based service that she uses most heavily is Google's native mapping and navigation on her Droid. And I asked her what she hopes never to see in relation to location-based services. Her answer was, my parents checking in. Please welcome Melissa Parrish.
Thank you, Karen, for that excellent introduction. Thank you to everyone for being here today. I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation with some incredible panelists. Before we turn to them to introduce themselves, I wanted to give the evening a little bit of context. And so in order to do that, I thought I'd talk about some of the really interesting takeaways that I found in the research that was released earlier this afternoon from Microsoft. They did a study about consumer adoption and perception of location-based services and the privacy implications thereof. And there were some key takeaways that I found really interesting. For example, 62% of consumers responded that they are aware of location-based services. And 51% reported that they have ever used a location-based service. And that struck me as a very high adoption rate for what is generally considered still an emerging technology from the consumer perspective. What's interesting is that then when you take a look at the number of respondents who said they felt very familiar with location-based services, the number starts to drop a little bit. So it goes down to about 38% So there's still a lot of education to be done, a lot of growth to be seen in consumer adoption. Now, the other thing I want to make sure to point out is Microsoft's research was not limited to location-based social networks like Loopt and Foursquare and Gowalla, which of course are the technologies that are talked about most frequently in the press today. They're very exciting, and we do like to talk about them a lot. But the research and what we're going to be talking about today, location and privacy, where are we headed, is really more about the full gamut of location-based services. So mapping and navigation, weather, traffic, retail and restaurant reviews and information, as well as location-based social networks. So there's a full gamut out there of what we could be talking about. And in fact, Microsoft's research showed that only 18% of their respondents reported using a location-based service for the purpose of sharing their location with others. And this is not too surprising when you consider that the thing respondents said they were most concerned about, 87%, said that they were most concerned about their location being shared with people or organizations that they hadn't specifically said they would share their information with. So there is a lot of concern on the part of consumers about how their location data is being used and shared. As I was saying to the panelists earlier, I'm an analyst. I love this data, but it's certainly maybe not the most exciting piece to a lot of you in the audience. So now I'd love to turn it over to the panelists, ask you each to introduce yourselves, and as you're telling us a little bit about who you are, the organizations you work for, and what you do there, I'd also love to ask you to share with us your biggest concern where location and privacy are at the moment and where they're going. Do you want to start, Laura?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I am Laura Berger. I'm with the Federal Trade Commission Division of Privacy and Identity Protection. We are primarily, for those of you who may not know, we are primarily a civil law enforcement agency, but tonight I think we'll talk about one of our other missions and things that we work on, our policy work in the privacy area as well. I'd like to thank the Churchill Club for having me, and I look forward to hearing lots of questions from you in the audience.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. Thanks to the Churchill Club. Always an amazing turnout. From some of the people I know in the audience, there are any number of people who could be up here on the stage giving just as good a presentation. I wonder about all the people I don't know who know as much about this as I do, perhaps. But Center for Democracy and Technology is a nonprofit public policy organization headquartered in Washington, although I'm here in San Francisco at CDT West. And we work on the constellation of policy issues that provide the legal framework for the growth and development of the internet and all of the services associated with it. A little bit uniquely, we're supported both by nonprofit foundations, Ford and MacArthur and that type, as well as by corporations and trade associations. We very much believe in working with companies to develop the solutions around these problems. We approach them from a consumer perspective and a consumer advocacy perspective, but very much believe that in order for this technology, Center for Democracy and Technology, the democracy piece, in order for it to have this potential that we all believe in, to support democratization and human development, that it needs a policy framework, and that policy framework based upon competition and innovation and openness and decentralization, user control, et cetera. And there's a policy framework that makes this happen. And that's constantly a challenge, constantly subject to being redefined and debated, and we all need to work together to promote that policy framework that will allow the internet to remain open, innovative, and free. And I think with this technology of location, clearly one of the dominant trends in the technology, I look at it both from the perspective of the consumer and the benefits that it brings, as well as the questions about where that data might be flowing. I also look at it from the government perspective side, and we can talk about that. as I say, every one of us here is carrying a location tracking device, which, so long as it's on, is obviously reporting our location to the network, and that's available to the government, at least according to the Justice Department's view, without a search warrant.
And so, Jim, would that maybe be where your biggest concern for location
Well,
privacy
you know,
is?
I sometimes say I'm a paid paranoid. I'm sort of a paid paranoid. I'm paid to sort of worry about these things, and I worry both on the commercial side and the government side. I see the interest at stake on both sides, and I see the values at stake on both sides, and I think we need to develop a privacy framework that works.
I come back to that point, but let's let the other panelists introduce themselves, and we'll come back to that.
By the way, that tracking device Jim was talking about was your smartphone, so, you know, the tag wasn't put on you guys walking in the door. Brian Knapp, General Counsel, Chief Operating Officer at Loopt. Loopt is a mobile application that helps you discover the world around you, your friends, places, events, and helps you connect with those things. I've been actually working with Loopt as outside counsel now in-house on these issues since 2005. So we've been sort of in the game for quite a while, and I think the company, to its credit, young founders, the board, the investors have always taken location privacy very seriously. To that end, if I say good, responsible things, I'm here on behalf of Loopt. If I say bad, irresponsible things, those are my personal views and my personal views only. My biggest concern is getting a letter from Laura. My second biggest concern is actually a real concern of ours has always been an irresponsible company coming into the space and frankly sort of blowing it for everyone. So it's part of we've been out there a lot talking about these kinds of issues because we're not afraid of them. We're proud of what we do. We want to grow this area of the industry. We also think it's been important to be proactive in terms of shaping the privacy practices out there and trying to hold a high bar to these applications and new services because this stuff has huge potential, but it's also obviously a serious piece of information. So,
excellent. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. I'm Brendon Lynch with Microsoft. Delighted to be with all of you here for this discussion tonight. My role at Microsoft is Chief Privacy Officer, which means I oversee our privacy program, which is a mixture of helping set the policies and the processes and tools and everything to make that all work within a large, diverse organization, which is always trying to innovate, as well as in an advisory role to the product and service teams on how they can build privacy in, as well as managing a lot of the external relationships with everything from regulators through to consumer advocacy groups and ultimately customers as well. So thank you.
Brendon, what's your biggest concern?
Damn.
They came back to that one.
Yeah. No, I think for me it's probably a user unknowingly broadcasting their location in a public way that has consequences for their personal safety. And I would say as a parent, I particularly worry about that for children. So.
Excellent. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Owen Tripp. I'm the co-founder and chief operating officer at Reputation.com. And I have to say just quickly that I'm so delighted that there are this many people of this level of sophistication and leadership on this topic in one room. It just shows that there's heat around what we're doing, and I'm very glad for that. My duties at Reputation.com include creating and fomenting an ecosystem for consumer-led privacy. Hopefully we'll dip into that topic tonight. My biggest concern is not just these independent pieces of data that are collected about you, but the inferences that can be drawn, correctly or incorrectly, about your behaviors, your lifestyle, what you care about, what you don't care about, and how those might be used to make decisions about you for your financial future, for your romantic future maybe, for your collegiate and educational future. And we'll talk more about that tonight.
Great, thank you. I want to come back to Laura and ask you what your biggest concern is.
That you'll come back to me with that question. I so easily shrugged it off the first time. So, I'll just highlight, I know this is a sophisticated audience, but I don't want to overestimate the importance of what we've been doing to all of you in your busy schedules. How many of you happen to have glanced at some point, the proposed framework for privacy that the FTC issued last month for comment. Okay, because the comment period's been extended until February 18th, so still plenty of time. You can even write them a note of how outrageous I was here, speaking on my own behalf, of course. But so, I mean, I guess I would just, the concerns highlighted in that report about, the lack of transparency, the need to improve the transparency of how consumers' information is collected and used, and as Owen was pointing out, in many cases accumulated by parties the consumers have no direct relationship with. That's among my big concerns too, and among the things that we highlighted in the report for a solution.
Great, thank you. And it's interesting because we've been using words like consumer data, consumer privacy, and I think if we were to ask the man on the street, if you will, what they mean when they hear or think of those things, I bet if we asked 5 people, we would get 5 different answers. And so I'd love to ask the panel here, what do you mean when you talk about consumer data? And what do you think consumers think of when they hear that? Is there a difference? Whoever would like to start, please feel free. We're going to try to keep this a little bit informal and conversational as we go along. So. Sure.
I'd love to jump in because we think about privacy. I mean, no one's a bigger advocate for our users than we are, right? That's the whole company, and acquiring those users and retaining those users is based on a trust exchange that we have with them, right? So we are our biggest privacy advocates for our own users, right? And we take that very seriously. If I may, Seth Godin, who I'm sure all of you are familiar with, serial entrepreneur marketer, had this great post a couple months ago that I like to just read a little part of because I think it gets to the heart of how users think about it and how we're trying to treat privacy by design, which is also highlighted in the FTC report. And he said, do you really care about privacy? He said, I don't think you do, because if you really cared about privacy, you wouldn't use a credit card, you wouldn't use the phone. And he talks about how privacy shouldn't be assumed these days. There's sort of a religion of no privacy. What he says is what most of us care about is not being surprised along the way. You just don't want to be surprised about how people are going to use your data, who they're going to share it with, what's going to happen when you use a website or an application, right? And I think ultimately that, and the reason I like to mention that, I think it cuts right to the heart of how users really think about it, right? They don't want to sign up for Loopt, and they think they got one thing, but it's something else is happening with their location. They don't want to be surprised along the way, and that's something we really try to keep in mind in terms of our privacy by design approach in thinking about our users.
What I would add to that, I think in some ways we don't define what privacy is as an industry. The individuals do, and we talk about, I think you hear terms, the consumer wants this, but reality is there is no such thing as the consumer because there's this wide spectrum of views, and that's part of the challenge and opportunity I think we have is to understand that breadth of perspective and tailor to all of that. Some people will want fine-grained, granular control and 20-page privacy statements to pour through. Other people just want to be safe, and they just look after me. I just want to feel like I'm in a trusted, safe place. And some people may not care at all. And so in some ways, that's how I define it. It's what they tell us, and it's evolving over time. And as technology innovations come along, and as adoptions of those technologies evolve, that keeps moving. So I think we as an industry and as other stakeholders need to be mindful of the way this is evolving and keep up and keep ahead ultimately, but cater to everybody.
I think there's another way to, Brian talked about surprise, and Brendon talked about trust and safety. I think another key element of privacy is fairness. And when privacy experts talk about informational privacy, at least, we talk about fair information practices. How do you collect and use information in the context of a commercial transaction, and then how do you use that information either to deliver a service or to make decisions about people? And if you look through the FTC report, the FTC, like all of the legal frameworks, in fact, are based upon this concept of fair information practices, which have to do with the notice question, have to do with choice, have to do with security of the data as well. And people always talk about, well, we need a new definition of privacy. It does mean different things to different people in different contexts. context, but if you look at that concept of fair information practices, at least in terms of the commercial data, I think you find the right framework. And as a business perspective, I think thinking about fairness helps sort of internalize the concept of privacy in the business design process and the business models and the technology, et
But
cetera.
so here's the question about the data, right? The data that remains or does not remain private. The research from Microsoft shows that consumers are scared that something that is essentially what we in this room might refer to as personally identifiable information gets into the hand of a marketer somewhere. Now, I'm on Forrester's interactive marketing team. I speak with marketers all the time, and I can tell you that speaking from the marketer's perspective, the vast majority of marketers are not interested in knowing that Melissa Parrish, who lives at this address, just made this purchase at this retail location. They're interested in the audience at scale that they're reaching. So to what extent do you think the issue is very personally identifiable information getting into the wrong hands versus something a little bit more innocuous, perhaps, from a consumer perspective?
Yeah, so leading up to the privacy report that we put out for comment, the framework, we had a bunch of roundtable meetings around the country the preceding year and talked about what is the state of privacy. In the kind of like ancient history of the FTC's privacy work in the previous decade, we had these fair information practices that included giving privacy notices to consumers so they could have the information they needed to make good decisions about their data. And one of the things that came out of it, one of the themes that led up to the roundtables and the things that was affirmed by it is that consumers don't really understand what's happening with their data. And one of the part of the report talks about some of the research presented where consumers, a majority of consumers looking at a site thought if it had a privacy policy, that meant that their data was not shared. I think what privacy means is that consumers are given both the information and the tools that they need to make effective decisions about their data.
So I think that's...
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to... I'm skipping your points tonight. I apologize. But the point about what you referred to as very personally identifiable information, one of the things that we also cited as a need for this proposed framework to talk about some of these issues publicly is that there's really not a bright line between what's personally identifiable and what's not. Information can be reformulated and enhanced and retained for a sufficient period of time, and there's just not a bright line as to what's identifiable and what's not.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's one of the more interesting points around the whole conversation about location and privacy. So the question of what the data is, how the data can be used, and then the inferences, of course, which I definitely wanted to talk about at this point, but within the context of understanding that it's a question of what the data is, how it's being shared, and the inferences that can be made from it. Let's start thinking about where the burden lies for responsibility for things like education and protection. But let's dig a little bit more into that really interesting point that you made, Owen, at the beginning about inferences. So I think what you're getting at here is sort of several steps down the logical chain of what can happen with when a consumer posts data somewhere. So talk a little bit about that.
Right. I mean, let's start with a very simple example of this. I may understand when I'm using a GPS system or a smartphone for navigation that if I enter the destination is understood by whoever I'm entering it to. And if I enter some information about the course I'd like to take, that also is understood. There is a contractual and tacit understanding of that. But I may not understand that my speed is also being calculated as I travel along that route, and that information could be used to make an inference which could be shared about my driving habits. Right? I'm not saying this is happening today, but it could be. And it's not beyond the realm of belief. And you can bet your bottom dollar that insurance companies would love to have that information because they can make better decisions about drivers based on how fast they travel on roads. So those are the inferences that are frightening to consumers when you lay it out that way. There are examples of this in health insurance based on what kind of foods you eat and what kinds of places you visit. And those are the concerning ones. And so the hardest question for me is, how then do you present that in a way that a consumer can both understand it and understand that trade-off that they're making in exchange for some convenience? They're also providing information which can be consumed in a lot of different ways. But make that work, as my fellow panelists are saying, for a very wide spectrum of perspectives on this.
Yeah, I think the making it work for a wide spectrum of consumers is one thing. I think the other thing is making the mechanism of education work on a variety of devices. So I'd love to hear more about how this education piece is being tackled today. And then let's talk a little bit about where you think that burden for education lies and how you think it might be facilitated as location-based services kind of grow and evolve. Who has some thoughts about that?
I mean, I think, again, if you look at it, you can't attack this as a legal compliance issue, right? It's a product marketing opportunity. It's marketing, it's customer service. And if you think about it that way, you say, well, I have a number of touch points along the way. Amy Nigam used to talk a lot about teachable moments, right? So I have the App Store landing page copy before I download the application. I have a consents moment as they're signing up for it. I have my settings. I have notices along the way, right? We have all of our advertising. We have our PR conversation there. We have our customer service representatives, our FAQs. These are all different little touch points. And I will tell you, when I started Loopt in 2007, or I started writing consents for them, they were talking feature phone days, and it's not natural for a lawyer to write things in like 10 words or less, you know? And you just have to have that discipline to say, okay, what do I really need to get across here? No, shall, take that out. So, you know, and really be disciplined about what points I want to get across the way, and does it make sense in this moment in time? The FTC report, while not perfect, has some really good points along the way. That was a cheap shot, I'm sorry. I have more substantive ones coming. You know, talks about, you know, moments in time, almost trying to give people real-time notice, right? And that's the best possible teachable moment, because as I'm setting something up or as I'm doing something, you're educating them along the way. And that's typical product development, right? And so that's how you need to approach privacy, I think, as an organization these days to be successful.
I would agree with that and sort of add another dimension too. If we're talking about mobile phone-based services, there's another player too, which is the service provider. And they have a direct relationship, and they're provisioning people with these devices. There's probably some educational opportunity there, broadly speaking. But ultimately, we want, I think, the world where individuals do get these timely, just-in-time sort of moments where they can make an informed decision. The way that we've managed to do that within our mobile platform, Windows Phone 7, is to make sure that the location thing is off by default. With the applications that are installed, pre-installed, the first time the user uses them, there's a prompt, clear prompt that comes up. Very few words, and I know that's tough for lawyers because you're paid by the word. But and they make an informed decision. There's linked to the privacy statement if they want more words. And then also with the App Store again. So I would agree with that. But there's another player here too, and there's a lot in this whole ecosystem. From the application providers, the platform providers, both in terms of what's built into the devices, but also their app stores, and then of course also the service providers that are provisioning the device.
Which I think says that, you know, we do have sort of a three-sided set of interests here, all of which have a role to play. So there's the consumer who needs to take some interest in his or her own privacy and educate themselves. There is the corporate practices. There is the sort of regulatory backstop provided by the FTC and at the state level as well. I think the complexity, to me, the complexity of the platform, as Brendon is saying, is to me one of the major problems. That you have, you have the browser, the app, the device maker, the service provider, and there are multiple things going on at once. And I do think there is need for somewhat more commonality across industry and somewhat more of a better understanding and maybe some best practices. I saw sort of in the Commerce Department report, which paralleled the FTC report, this call for industry to step forward with the government in the background, after all, to enforce these promises and to enforce some baselines. But I think that the mobile app space just calls out for the development of some shared understanding among the various participants in this ecosystem about what the rules are.
Just to jump in on that real quick, I think Windows Phone 7's done a great job. I think Apple and the iPhone system, say what you want about how closed it is. They've taken a lot of responsibility, I think, for privacy in terms of the kind of data that, and it's not perfect, but the kind of data that app providers can access. In fact, last year they said something about if you're going to access the location, geolocation API, you have to have at your core location functionality. You can't just access it for advertising. They force a platform notification if the app you just opened is trying to access the location of your smartphone. The developer can't override that. They have an icon, a persistent icon that now shows up if location's being used on the application. So I think there are some great things at the platform level that are starting to happen right now, and Android's doing similar things that I think are helpful to users and consumers, and actually app providers as well.
But I think the Wall Street Journal found that a lot of that was not being adhered to in practice.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not commenting on any particular company at all, but we can't look at
Laura's not. Everyone else might be.
Yeah, but I mean, I can look at a privacy notice and I can say, wow, this is simple and clear, and I think I know what a reasonable consumer would take from it, but I can't say if it complies with the legal obligation to be, to not be deceptive or unfair to consumers until I know if the underlying practices match up with it. And I think, conveying to a reasonable consumer what your practices are, when you're the one collecting the data and using it, you pretty clearly share in that burden. And so to figure out what a reasonable consumer will take from your claim, you do need to look to not just like your course of dealing with the consumer, but to what their expectations are based on their experiences in the broader marketplace.
And I think the idea of consumer expectations is interesting, especially considering that unfortunately, there are many consumers out there who are not reading and will continue to not read those real-time messages.
Yes.
This just happened last weekend. I'm sure everybody here saw Facebook actually released a new product quite well. The defaults, I think the industry was really comfortable this time with the way privacy was, the privacy settings were discussed for the consumer. And there was still an outcry because though a window would pop up and say, this is the data that's being shared with this application, allow, don't allow, there's a large portion of consumers that are not reading that. So my question is, can we expect that as location-based services grow, consumers are going to start reading that stuff
No.
more? Or is there...
No. Can we expect that anybody's going to read anything is a real indifferent question. Churchill Club of the future, should we be reading anything? So,
I mean, look, the consumer is reading something or they wouldn't be downloading the app. They saw something they liked. So
well,
clearly
that's right.
There's some attention span there and
No, that's
capability
right.
to read.
But listen, privacy policies are speed bumps on your route to, getting free burger coupons on the internet, right? They're not embraced. They're not well understood. I agree with Brian wholeheartedly that this becomes part of the product equation. I have to say that there's a third way, right? There's the government, there's the industry, and then there's an entire industry of which we are a part that's growing up to try to provide for-profit services to consumers to try to crack that consumer equation. And here's why this is important. There are privacy professionals in the audience. I would be shocked if any of you work in teams that are larger than 5 people, and you're working at some of the biggest companies in the world. Brendon and I were just sitting here. He has a team of 40. That's the largest privacy group I've ever heard at any company anywhere. And so if industry has a fundamental tension, as I think we all would agree, with privacy because it can pose challenges to their commercial model, then the third way is to provide consumer services where you're providing utility to the consumer to unpack and understand these things. And there are companies beyond ours that do that. Trustee is a company that's in the audience tonight that has turned into a for-profit entity to help solve this problem.
Yes, but I think one thing we need to be careful of is, are we putting too much burden on the consumer? I think, I go back to my spectrum concept earlier, there are some people that do want that detail, and I think the detailed statement is actually really good for transparency, because there are people like Jim's organization and others that do read them and challenge us if they don't see things they like. But I do worry that the notice and choice model is under strain, because it's really placing too much burden on the consumer. And I'm not saying it needs to be wholesale replaced, but we need to add to it. And I kind of come back a little bit to Jim's idea of fairness as maybe another safety net for this, is that yes, we need to provide notice and choice and these controls, and for the consumers that want to buy service to help them further, but we also need to establish the baseline. And I think that comes back to Brian and I talked about what the platforms are doing, and we know that there's influence on the applications and others, but there needs to be a sort of a baseline understanding. I think I want your job, maybe. I don't know, because I sound like I'm preparing for that in some way.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that was really teased out, one of the themes of the roundtables, and there's only just a few things that we're seeking to set forth in the framework. So privacy by design has been mentioned, simplified notice and choice, and greater transparency. And in talking about simplified choice for consumers, there's wide recognition that a privacy notice, as traditionally constructed, is not generally, has not evolved to be an effective means for consumers to get information. And I think that's exacerbated in the mobile context, where you have a small screen. And the FTC has itself, last summer we brought a case against a company that, the Sears case, where we settled allegations that because the company had invited consumers to be tracked online in exchange for $10, and Sears was going to track their browsing behavior, the company had not adequately disclosed that it was also going to track the contents of their communications and account numbers and shopping cart contents. But the disclosure was there. The key point that I'm trying to get across is that it was there. It's just that the consumer, to attain the disclosure, had to scroll down through 7 screens near the end of the registration process, at which point they're just like, I should be getting more than $10 for this. So I think there's widespread recognition, not just in the policy context, but also in the law enforcement, that you're not getting your notice done if you're not doing it effectively.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point that I don't know we've made clearly enough, that when we're talking about location and privacy, it isn't just the information that's being transmitted by the tracking device that we all have. It's also the content of any additional communication that takes place on these applications and services. So do you feel like with the proliferation of mobile devices of all kinds, not just phones, the proliferation of location-based services that will begin requiring, facilitating deeper conversations and content, do you think that regulation is going to have an even heavier burden to help protect consumers from the content that they are willingly sharing without perhaps understanding the implications of the depth of that content? Was that complicated? I think that was complicated.
You're asking about the role of regulation. I think, to your point on how complicated the question was, I think it's nearly impossible to create detailed regulations that are going to keep up with the innovation that's happening. So Jim's been doing a lot of work on the Electronic Communications and Privacy Act, which has been out of date. I think 86 was the year. CP&I, Customer Proprietary Network Information Bill, which we potentially fell under, we didn't end up falling under, also very out of date. And so either you're going to have a high-level privacy bill that's pretty much meaningless, or you're going to have something detailed that by the time it hits the book, it's out of date, and it's going to potentially stifle innovation, which is very serious. I think the FTC as an enforcement agency certainly has a role, as Jim said, as a backstop. And they also like to legislate a little bit with their guidelines and their FAQs. So we let them get away with that, which is fine. I love those FAQs. Follow every one of them. But I think ultimately industry, this is an industry role. And I don't think, the companies that are most successful today, whether it's Google, Facebook, Twitter, these companies all take privacy very seriously, and they all have in-house counsel, usually several people working on these issues, and I don't think there's any mistake of that correlation, that the most successful companies are in the valley and they're taking privacy very seriously because, again, they believe that there's a connection of trust with their users, and they're not going to remain successful companies. They didn't get to where they were by not taking it seriously. Now, again, nobody's perfect, and we have the scale of those companies. You're going to make some mistakes, but I think it's part of the business model these days, and it has to be an industry-led effort ultimately.
So I want to turn to the question of, well, there are two questions that I want to make sure that we get to. One is one that we were all talking about a little bit before we all sat down to dinner, which is, the conversation so far, I think if we went back and watched it on YouTube, we would be, we're mostly talking about the monetization of data. And there's another reason that sharing of data can be perhaps not in a user's best interest. And I'm thinking of cases of law enforcement where many of you, I'm sure, have been reading recently about some well-connected police departments, local police departments across the country that are now using location-based social networks specifically to locate people that they were looking for anyway. So my question is, do you see this becoming a more interesting and complicated issue, shall we say, going forward as more people become involved with location-based services? And where do you think that conversation will go in terms of the consumer privacy versus public information being used for criminal prosecution, essentially?
Just quickly, I know Jim will have a lot to say on this. If you get a Loopt friend invite from the local sheriff, don't accept it. I'll tell you, if you do, he might track you. We actually worked with EFF, Kevin Bankston, I know, is here, CDT, to develop an information request policy, which we believe our legal position is very clear under ECPA, even though we support the reform effort. Because people were clearly concerned about, if the government comes calling, are you going to give up my location information? We have a very high standard. It's a warrant standard to get the location of our users. That said, we also want to cooperate with law enforcement. I've gotten a phone call about a kidnapping, a live kidnapping. That's a really serious situation, and you got to balance the two. Now, DOJ, we're having hearings on the Hill today or yesterday. Was it yesterday?
Yesterday, yeah.
And I think without having ECPA reform paired with potentially higher standards in terms of the length of our data retention requirements is very concerning, because now I got to have data for 2 years, and it's up, there's an open question about what the standard is to get that data.
Let me try to frame the question or the issue this way. There is nothing that is off limits to the government, and that is legitimate. The government has compelling interests. I mean, if your child is missing, you want the FBI or the local police on that case. National security, terrorism, all kinds of other crime. The question is, what should the standard be? And what are the checks and balances? That's the essence of our democratic society, the checks and balances. And we live now under a set of rules, and the companies are caught in the middle. They want to both protect their consumer privacy and cooperate with the government, and they're faced with some of these urgent requests. The rules are a hodgepodge of court decisions and statutes, both of which are out of sync with the way the technology is used. I think it would astonish most people to realize that your email, if you print it out and put it in your file cabinet, or if you carry it with you on your device, fully protected by the Constitution, fully protected by the warrant requirement, just like on TV, knock, knock, police, open up, we have a warrant. The police can bust in, but they have to have that warrant. If it's stored on the cloud, after 180 days, according to this 1986 law, it loses that protection, and it's available with a prosecutor's subpoena. Subpoena, I always say, is Latin for no judge has ever seen this. that is based upon this notion. In 1986, Congress said, no one's ever going to store email more than 30 days, and that was the rule at the time. Of course, storage was expensive. So they said 180 days. That's like abandoned property. That's like a defunct account or something. So after that, we won't protect it. Clearly, that has to catch up. The courts have been completely unable so far. So far, only one circuit court has conclusively ruled on this issue, and that's being challenged and may even be set aside. The Ninth Circuit ruled that text messages were protected, overturned on other grounds in the Supreme Court. The 11th Circuit ruled that email was not protected. They vacated that opinion when various parties went in and explained to them what the consequences of it were, but vacated, which means it means nothing anymore. Sixth Circuit had an opinion saying it was protected. They vacated that. Now they've ruled again. Both sides are asking for that to be reconsidered. The Supreme Court had a case this summer on texting, and they basically said, we don't really understand this technology. We're going to decide this case on the narrowest possible grounds. We're going to be very slow in resolving these issues, which is why Loopt and Microsoft and Google and Facebook and a host of companies and public interest groups have joined in a campaign to try to urge Congress to go back to 1986, what was happening then. Cell phones were just coming out. The internet was just being commercialized. Email was just starting. Congress did establish some laws. They now look outdated. Time for Congress to address those. Provide the emergency exception. You got to have an emergency exception, absolutely. Recognize the governmental interests, but take that concept of checks and balances from the Constitution and extend it to this new technology. I think that's critical.
So is it, we'll talk about this point and then we'll turn to audience questions, so get those ready for us. So is it possible and or desirable for both consumer protection regulations and these potentially more weighty legislation issues to move in parallel? Is there any likelihood of them moving forward at a similar pace, and for the two conversations to be had in the same context, for the two sides of this issue to actually talk to each other? What do you think?
I don't know which issue we're talking about. I just got a little lost. But in terms of like the consumer privacy as against like companies, which is kind of where the FTC's focus is. Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is, again, my opinion, but, what Congress legislates and what agencies feel comfortable doing in law enforcement, to say this is what a reasonable consumer could take from this, kind of are two sides of the same thing. Like, here's where we think we are culturally, where we think, what we think reasonable people expect a company to do, to explain to consumers what they're doing with their data. So yeah, I mean, that could happen. That's a pretty thought, and I believe in it.
Before we move to the open floor, I thought we've talked about a lot of, I think, downsides of this thing, and I'll just try and move it to maybe a little bit more of a positive place. But a couple of points from the research, one you did mention and one you didn't, was consumers really value location-based services. So they have a really good role in societal development. For those that are using them, they love them. They derive value. So we've got to keep that in mind. I think they also have a potentially great economic impact too, because there was some data in the study that showed 18% of the people had knowingly received advertising which was location-based. So they'd recognized this advertising specifically had something to do with the location that they were in, whether it was to visit a store nearby or to do something that's really local-based. And to me, it was surprising. 50% of them took action. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a much greater adoption rate of online advertising than the other forms. So there's actually a really good economic model here too. And I think so for those of you in industry, yes, there are some downsides to location. Yes, there are some gray areas, and there's a lot that we need to do as an industry to to ensure that we win the trust and confidence of all of the users, but there's also a potential great upside for society and for economy as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Though there is a lot of consumer fear out there, the fact that, the data that we started with, 62% of consumers told you that they had ever heard of these services, and 51% went ahead and tried them. So there is value there. Consumers realize that.
And I don't even think that's the big hurdle here, is getting consumers to the point where they understand the company they're interacting with, the one whose app they're downloading or the one whose ad they're clicking. To get consumers to the point where they understand what that company is doing is not the big hurdle. It's to get them to the point where they understand all the different players, like the ad networks who the app might be sharing their data with, or the carrier data that they might be using to enhance their profile of the user. It's the kind of behind-the-scenes third parties to these interactions that I think are going to be a real challenge for innovators to work with.
Definitely. All right, so let's ask for some questions from the audience out there. Do we have anybody with something they'd like to ask us? We've got a question back here. Great. Microphone behind you.
Great. So, Jim, you said that there's no data that's off limits to the government. And there are actually a couple of things that are off limits to the government. Data that doesn't exist and was never recorded is off limits to the government. It's off limits by the rules of physics. Data that was properly encrypted and kept in personal devices and never stored in the cloud in a way that can be decrypted is also off limits to the government, this time by the rules of mathematics. And while these location-based services are indeed compelling, and people like to use them and they want to have maps and various other things that are based on their location, it seems the industry has become quite lazy about actually protecting that last part, the stuff that's in the cloud, the stuff that's logged, the stuff that actually can have real privacy consequences for them. It's possible technically in many cases to design these applications so that they deliver the value to the customer, but which don't present the same privacy risk. And I think we really need to be on the industry about being lazy about that. Loopt, a lot of stuff in Loopt could happen if Loopt couldn't see my location, but it had the ability to send it to my friends, for example, without it being able to be aware of that information. Not everything, and there are certain things which, for engineering reasons, do make you want to put it in the cloud, but not necessarily remember it. So I would like to see more push for that, because that is where or keeping data just in your own machine, in your own phone, so that it's not actually done in the cloud, where all these questions come up. If it's not there in the cloud, it can't come back to bite you. And
is your lazy comment based on something?
It's a comment saying that it's harder to do it this way. It is more work to design it, to do this privacy by design, to not keep the information in the cloud, to deliberately erase information and give up the ability to do things with it later.
It absolutely is. It's a pretty big presumption, though, to assume that we or any of the other popular companies out there are being lazy, right? So I do think, and in fact, one of our founders was a data security expert from Stanford, and I think we have taken a lot of those steps. We think really seriously about these things. I think while we need to have a reasonable engineering architecture that allows us to provide our business cost effectively and be nimble and innovate, we have actually thought about a lot of these issues, and we've talked about them quite extensively. And I think speaking for my other colleagues in industry, they're doing much of the same. So I think for the most part, while very little data security out there is absolutely perfect, I think there is a lot of innovation happening there, and I think companies are taking it very seriously, and we're investing in it.
So it wasn't meant to be a personal citation against your company. I cited that as an example just because you were on the panel, not because I thought you were particularly being lazy.
I don't know that the popular companies out there are being lazy. I actually think they're really not being lazy about this. I think they're taking it very seriously.
Who are we cheering for, by the way?
Thank you for that. Do we have another question from the audience? Looks like maybe we have several. There we go.
Thank you. David Nordforst from Stanford. I thought of actually picking up on the previous question. Two things that you brought up as problems here, complexity, and how we're certain that both parties are aware of the consensual agreement. Okay? So that's a bit difficult to get past because these things get more and more complex. So maybe we should look for something really simple, and maybe there is certain amounts of information where you just can't create consent around the transfer. I mean, we have other things in society that we cannot sell sexual services, for example, right? So we have the right to our bodies and can't make deals around that. So maybe now the time has come that certain amounts of information that we see as our own and private, that earlier have not been able to be measured or spread around, now should enter those spheres. Certain things, you know, my geographical position within some distance is something that I can't sign an agreement on that you guys can do what you want to with, because, you know, it's kind of a human right. So what then would be the private information sphere that that we could define as everybody's human right that isn't tradable?
So, may I respond to that? I love this idea, and actually it's a very European way of characterizing the question. It is, because the Europeans, and they've written this into their data privacy directives, feel that this is a human right. We talk about it in America as a constitutional right. It comes out of, I think, the Fourth Amendment. But in Europe, it's a human right. The problem I have, as I think everybody else on this panel has a law degree. I'm not sure about that. Do you have a law degree? No. Okay, you and me. So the problem I have with that as a practitioner is you can make that decision with a provider of a service to you. But unfortunately, a lot of what you would say is private and should never be disclosed and you never want to have public can be triangulated without your consent based on other data that's in the ecosystem. And that's really the big problem that I see with the location-based consent, right? Because I can deduce certain things about you, about your whereabouts, using all kinds of other forms of data. And just one very quick example to put a point on this. We have run experiments where we can, not because you tell us where you live, and not because you share your photos with us, we can deduce where you live, and based on photos that you're posting to websites, we examine the metadata to see the location that you are where you're taking that photo, and deduce that you're away from home. And that's a safety concern, right? That's just an example. And so the problem is there's no one entity that can make that contract with you, in my opinion.
Next question.
Hi, my name is David. I'm here just as an engaged consumer. So I'm in town visiting from New York. Used my Droid today, for example, Google Latitude. Found where I was. I needed to find a Starbucks. Found the local Starbucks. Connected. Gave me driving directions. I used my rental car, drove there. Love the access. I'm curious, as a consumer, sort of where the line is of saying, I can have my cake and eat it too. I want this access. I want to be connected. I want everything at my fingertips. And at the same time, I want to be protected and know that nobody is using my information to ultimately harm me. So I'm just curious if you guys can talk about that, sort of where the line is with the responsibility as a consumer to have that access, but also to be protected.
Yeah, and if I may, I'd love to piggyback on your question there and frame the context of your answers also a bit forward-looking. So we've been talking a lot about mobile phones, but as everyone in this room knows, there's a lot of location-based innovation around other kinds of mobile devices, cars and sneakers even. So as we're beginning to, yes, thank you, as we're beginning to talk about where that line is, let's also think about all these new location-based products and services that are coming out.
Sorry, just one piece I left off, talking about companies that are innovating much faster than the law is keeping up with them. That seems like it's a continuing evolution, right? And there are companies that are in this that are for-profit, trying to make money. So just how does all of that fit together to ultimately access the consumer or provide the consumer access and protection at the same time?
Great.
You know, I think that there's no perfect solution. There's no single solution. And we've talked about elements of the solution. I just want to say that I think, you know, that the one thing that I think consumers do understand, they do understand the advertisement piece. And I'm not sure that the worry of consumers is about advertisements. I mean, Trustee, I think, in fact, did some studies in terms of not the mobile context, but general behavioral advertising, and that consumers more or less understand that free is not truly free, that it's advertising supported, and that involves the collection of information for the customization of ads. I think one of the big things that, and I think consumers accept that. Consumers understand advertising, they understand targeted advertising, I think, and I think they're prepared to take that part of the deal. I think they have a great fear on what are the other uses to be made of the data, and I think they have a great fear about the sort of inferences beyond the delivery of that ad, particularly when you go into insurance, employment, credit, which, you know, are three of the critical things in our lives. I also think that companies have an obligation, Laura mentioned privacy by design, you know, to think about how much they collect and to think about how to minimize how much they collect. I mean, that's one element of the equation, so that if you were collecting it, delivering the ad, preparing that profile, perhaps not on a strictly personalized basis, there's no perfect single solution to this problem.
Yeah, I mean, but there are some real common sense guiding principles. So, you know, if a consumer is you know, enlisting an online service to tell them what the weather's going to be, we give an example in the privacy framework that you would expect the service to look at your location to give you an accurate reading. But you would not expect them to, you know, take your contact list or look at your call history or something like that. So, I mean, you know, the kind of common sense approach is that you are designing a service that consumers understand what the service is, and you're only collecting the information that you need to reasonably deliver the service. And, you know, on a bright note, you know, where consumers have been given choices about the kinds of ads that they see, many consumers have adjusted the kinds of ads that they see, which is great feedback for anybody trying to advertise to those consumers to have, but not, in fact, decided that they don't want to see any ads. You know, maybe some users will be in a position to say that in the future, but that's not been what's been happening so far.
I have to play devil's advocate here, because I love the idea of fair information principles. I love the idea of privacy by design. I thought, the first time I heard that, I thought it was a great concept. But I think we're being naive if we believe that companies will only go as far as what's exactly required to provide that service to the consumer. That can't be true by the law of economics, right? So much of what we do here, especially here in the Valley, is based on advertising, is based on knowledge of who's using our services. Why not collect that extra piece of information so that maybe that service we imagine in the future can be better enabled by the data we're collecting today? And so I would push back that this is inherent to the way people
I mean, the
build.
example that was just given, that's an example that we mention as a commonly accepted practice for which you don't have to give notice. If you're doing something to improve the design of your website or to kind of tabulate consumer reactions to your own service, that's a legitimate and kind of expected use of the data associated with just providing the service itself. But it's when you get into the things that are just more far afield, like what I mentioned about downloading a contact list from someone's phone who checks your weather service, that I think, you know, you do have some reason to question whether that's privacy by design.
Next question.
This is about informed consent, or notice and consent as called earlier. I mean, where do you see informed consent going in location-based services? How do you think we should design for it?
You know, I think, again, it's if you're thinking about it from a marketing perspective, right, I want to set their expectations. I want them to know what they're getting. And I think there's actually a lot of understanding about what location services are doing, you know, and trying to keep that consent very concise. I mean, keep in mind, though, and that's why I've never liked the whole opt-in, opt-out notice, because people have opted into all kinds of things. They have no idea what they're talking about, right? So I think from a marketing perspective, right, you have to, I don't want people on Loopt that don't understand what's going on, right? And I think that's sort of ultimately part of the consent, right? It's an educated consent because we're marketing a product appropriately. We're only using their data for what would be commonly accepted or implied in terms of that bargain. to provide the service. And they're going to get those messages all along the way, whether it's from our marketing or application or hearing about how it works from a friend or just trying it out and seeing how it works. So we're not going to surprise them along the way, right? So we sort of think about consent not as just a one-off thing, but as part of the life cycle of our relationship with the user from the moment we're trying to acquire them to hopefully, as long as they stay with us.
Yeah, what I would add to that, and it goes back to the fear I articulated at the beginning, was services like Brian's ones, services like a local search or navigation or getting a weather. There's something inherent in those services which consumers know that they're actually sharing their location information. I worry about the things where they aren't. Owen, you brought up a good example of geotagged photos. That's, I think, a great one where people might not realize, first of all, that the device is creating these tags, and then when they upload them to services, that tag is going with them. So I think that's where many of these things are really intuitive, and I think the notice and choice is kind of going to work for that because it's clear that I'm sharing it and I'm going in with eyes open. But there's a lot of things here where the eyes are not open, and I think that's the challenge area for us.
This is one thing that Laura mentioned, and it bears repeating, which is one of the nice things that I liked in the FTC report, was you said, let's, in fact, stop giving notice and asking people for consent for the uses that are inherent in the provision of the service. In other words, you order a book on Amazon, may we have your consent to have your address? You hereby consent to, and it's part of the answer in the mobile space, which is, you can easily waste a lot of time, and you get these long notices, both in the mobile world and the non-mobile world, wasting time getting the consumer to agree to things that are inherent in the transaction. It's the unexpected, as Brandon says, it's the unexpected for which you should be getting the consent. It's the unexpected that you should be calling out.
And so do you think as location-based services achieve greater consumer adoption, and as the industry moves forward, what is expected and what is unexpected, that there'll be a shift in sort of expectations?
I mean, I think it's when you have a product or service, you have really great marketing people who are trying to get consumers to notice it. What is it you're trying to get them to notice? That's what you're actually offering them. Do you know what I mean? The thing that you're using to draw the users to it, and you're very carefully designing this message, you just need to apply that to your information practices and be consistent. So, I mean, yes, to some extent, consumers' awareness or evolution of industry practices, you could say, may inform consumers' reasonable understanding of your practices, but you may be better off just thinking about it in terms of your own course of conduct with your customers.
Yeah. It looked like, okay, great. So next question.
Is this on? Okay. My name is Jessica Williams. I work at Yahoo. So I realize that this is a bigger discussion than just location-based services, but my curiosity is around what you guys feel about privacy by association, so that you're with somebody and they check you in somewhere, and how you aren't you're not giving your consent for that, yet they have given your consent for you, in essence. So if you could just talk a little bit to that. Thanks.
Secondhand smoke.
Yeah. I mean, I thought Facebook did an excellent job of creating places and finding that fine line between making it too onerous, because I think a lot of people, 90% of people probably like that and don't mind it, and they're out with their friends anyway. You're out with your friends. It's probably not a big secret that you're out with your friends, right? And this has been happening with pictures for a long time as well, right? But they created a framework where you initially have to opt in to allow people to tag you. I think the messaging was really, really good. It was really concise. And then once you've opted in to allow that happen, people continue to tag you. You can't until you click that. So I think that's one example where they did a really nice job of thinking through and balancing the feature set on that one.
It is sort of the democratization of surveillance. If you think about a sensor network, the biggest sensor network is 300 million people walking around with cameras that take photographs and can be uploaded, and increasingly that data is available to be mined. I don't know how we turn back the tide on that one.
Yeah, and
really.
I think it's interesting because we were just talking about common sense for marketers or application developers, and I think there's perhaps a level of common sense here for the user as well. There's a very famous instance years ago now where there was a picture taken of a celebrity's Malibu enclave that was posted to the internet.
Barbara Streisand.
Look
it up.
Shared very widely, and how can we get this taken down? Well, you can't, and so she just sort of had to deal with it. Well, in terms of the common sense here, I think there's also.
Wait, you're leaving off a really fun part of that story, though, and it's the reason why it's now called the Streisand Effect. When like a few thousand people maybe had seen what Melissa's describing,
right.
and then when she tried to pursue legal corrective
right.
action, suddenly tens of millions of people had seen it,
exactly.
and it didn't resolve the problem.
Exactly. So I think there's a common sense here, common sense thing going on here, where my friends know that I'm actually kind of uncomfortable with pictures of me being tagged, and they're my friends, so they know not to do it, essentially. And so I think there's something to be said for common sense, sort of all around, as we're talking about these services.
But again, it does have to do with the fairness of the use of the information. And if you're using the information to make one of those critical decisions about a person, employment, credit, or insurance, then I think the person should have some recourse and some ability to say, that's not me, or that's not fair, or that's not a good, correct inference to be drawn about me. Right now, social networking sites are exempt from, they're not considered to be credit reporting agencies, but obviously they are used for employment background checks.
Next question?
Hi. Diane Eisner from Waze. So I think this has been a fascinating conversation so far, and it keeps coming back to the point of education. And we as companies, I think we could be doing better than taking our marketing lingo as the point in time to educate people. And I want to pose to the panel the question, where is work being done, or where are companies doing amazing work that are breaking down these tough questions, not about what we should do, but what's there? So for example, what data, and I want to see it in a grid, data you collect, when it's used, who else has access. Very simple. We're making it complicated, but who's doing great work in that kind of simplicity that you might know of?
Well, one example I can think of is the layered notices, which began a few years ago. A bunch of companies have adopted them, including ours, where you begin, and if you go to ours as an example, it's really just one screen, slightly more. You've got to scroll a little bit. But it gives the highest level summary, and there's 7 standardized categories: what's collected, how it's used, what recourse you have, who to contact, what choices you have, that type of thing. And I think that's an example of it. And then there's more detail, all the details there if you click through. But I don't know that that's enough. There's a lot more discussions going on about, can we sort of mimic the food nutrition labeling and come up with a label for privacy which has some icons and some things. And I think where the challenge is, that it always comes back to, is extremely nuanced. It's complex. Every service and product is different, and there are some unique things to communicate. And it's not as simple as fat, calories, protein. There's actually a lot more to this. And so it's I don't know where the answer lies, but there's certainly efforts and thinking going into it.
I think a lot more. Google has made some effort in terms of allowing you to see at least the categorizations they've made of you, and Yahoo has done the same as well. I think a lot more can be done there, and you can turn the value proposition around, and people can say, I'm not interested in golf anymore, or I gave up that, or the access, to my mind, is one element of the privacy framework. That is the right of the individual to see what data is held about them. And if you truly are talking, again, we shouldn't boil the sum and substance of privacy down to advertising, because I think advertising is maybe the least intrusive piece of all of this. But a lot more can be done on user control there. On the other end of the spectrum, we had announcements in recent days, along the do not track lines, and there's some potentially significant development that could occur there as well. That's an upfront choice, that the access piece is a sort of, okay, now let me see what you have about me, and let me delete pieces of it. You can challenge your credit report. You can't challenge a lot of your marketing profiles. Now, the credit report, again, is more important.
For now.
Well, that's
no,
I agree.
No, but I think
absolutely.
that the
I agree.
the credit report is based on 3 pieces of highly correlated data from the 60s, and I think
I agree.
And it will be, and there are models today, what you do and how you behave. And by the way, the fear has traditionally been what you post on your Facebook wall and what that says about you. It's going to be what you post on your Facebook wall and how well that comports with what your location-based behavior actually is. So I may say, I'm going to the gym today, losing 10 pounds this year, but then we see you at Popeyes and Burger King, 5 times in the next 2 days. And that is very interesting to an insurance company.
Next question.
Hi, this is Vipul from Synopsys. So no doubt it's an enormously complex topic. By profession, I'm an IT manager. I understand the complexities. What comes to mind is that sometimes even I don't read any of the agreements that I sign up for on the web. Forget about my normal users or my grandma, right? Hats off to the do not call registry. Is there something that we are thinking on those lines? Do not collect. Like, do not collect my information if I don't opt for it, and there's a universal standard for it, whether at a protocol level or whatever way.
Yes, so one of the things that's mentioned in the proposed privacy framework is a do not track initiative and it would not be a registry. We have a do not call registry where you can register your phone number on a do not call list so that you won't be contacted by telemarketers. And this would not be the registry model. This would instead be something like a device on, like a persistent cookie on the consumer's particular device that would signal that that consumer should not be tracked either for purposes of collection of their data or for advertising to the consumer, and that they could make that election and it would be honored. But obviously there are a lot of questions, and many of them are posed in the framework about, well, how would this operate? We envisioned it as something that browsers would implement and offer to consumers, but it's something we're seeking a lot of feedback on.
So in the last week or so, you had 3 announcements by the 3 of the browser makers. Google is pursuing the persistent cookie. Microsoft is pursuing the do not track list, where some third party, let's say a CDT or a consortium of groups, would develop a list of the behavioral advertising networks. You could import that into your browser. And then Mozilla has announced the release of a bug, which is their way of making a change, introducing a new feature into the browser, which would put a header, use the HTTP header to basically send a do not track message. I think we somewhat prefer the HTTP header approach, but all 3 have their value and merits. What's interesting to me, this is a good opportunity for the industry, which is they could say, oh, what does it mean? It's too complicated. What does tracking mean? There's no definition. I really think this is an opportunity for the industry, both on the publisher side as well as the advertiser side, to show we can make a self-regulatory mechanism work. That is, if you tried to legislate this, I think it would get all messed up, really. But here you've got the 3 browser makers doing it as a choice, as an option. If the industry could say, oh, we don't have to respect it. And I think there's actually a legal theory that says they don't have to respect it. I think the better legal theory is that they should respect that expression of interest by the consumer. But if they take that on and say, okay, we will make this work, I think that can be a model for how you can have a design feature and a industry acceptance of it that empowers the consumer.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think it's a great example, actually, of industry stepping up. And with the browsers, there's 3 different models. It's too early to decide which one's probably going to win out. But I think there's 3 different models that all have pros and cons. I have a view on which one's better, but But also, it's the things you mentioned earlier. The advertising networks have now all got these insights into how you're being profiled in a way, and you've got some control to actually say, I'm not interested in that segment, I'm interested in that. That's really powerful. Then you've got transparency building in around the icon concepts and everything. So there's a lot going on in the space that I think is really promising and a good example of what industry needs to do. It's still early. There's a number of these things. The dust needs to settle on a lot of them. But it's not just about collection, too. It's also about use. Because the way that these services work is that collection is inherent. And if you block all collection, you actually kill the value. So I think we need to kind of separate. There's the collection of data or the transmission of data. Is how is that used, first of all, to build a profile, and then to actually use that profile. So there's kind of 3 steps there, and there's a broader discussion about use-based regulatory models as well, which I think partially get at this, recognizing that there is a lot of information flowing, both from devices to service providers, a lot of information flowing increasingly as we move to cloud, across national borders and the like, and that maybe we need to, in some ways, recognize that that's a new reality and start to look at placing some limitations on use, particularly use without consent, secondary uses without consent.
Next question?
My name is Richard Marabella. I want to make 2 points. One is the internet is very much international, so when we look at just strictly legal remedies, it has certain inherent limitations. And so the thing that dawns upon me from a technical point of view is the device that I'm using should have a lot of my privacy in there, so I'm not relying upon the other party to respect my interests, because it's probably myself more interested in respecting my interest than another party. So what I really like to be able to do is have my devices have the option that it'll just randomize an identity for a temporary session. Now, for some applications, that might prevent the application from working, but that's a trade-off that I have as a consumer to make. And I may want to do this from time to time, or I may want to do it all the time, depending upon, who I was for the moment. That's one point I like to make. The other one is to make these privacy notices useful. I may be unusual, but I very rarely go to a website and read the privacy notice. I'm unusual in that respect. Okay. What I would like to see is when you look at cable TV, when they have a movie on, they'll give you some rating information of language, sex, nudity, et cetera, et cetera. Just giving a simple description that people become familiar with. So instead of reading, on my, 7-inch screen, 32 pages of privacy information, it'll just tell me the information will be kept for 6 months or a year. And if a person doesn't fit within this profile, it would just get a rating of undefined. I wouldn't want to say, unrated, because that might have other implications. But you just give a person, say, if you fit a certain profile, you just say a simple letter system so a person knows what that is. And now when I go on my device, I can just scan down my list of applications and say which ones, let the application have the entire universe of my device. And if I think it's appropriate, I'll leave it there. And if I think it's inappropriate, I can turn that off. And so there's this arbitration between the service provider and my device on what things will be allowed. And you may, as a service provider, say, hey, you're not giving me enough information for me to make money. So the service is unavailable to you. Even though I didn't need that information to provide the service, you simply say look, we also have a paid-for program. So what you might see in the marketplace is some people might say, my privacy is more, I'd rather pay $1 a month and have my privacy than have everything disclosed. And the service provider might say, okay, this is a good system to kind of work the way the old days of the music industry worked with ASCAP.
So that's really interesting. Let's talk about that, because that is a point that we didn't touch on yet. Are there models that you each have been talking about where there is pay to play, I suppose, where a consumer can opt to pay a service provider rather than opt to share data? Are there conversations like this going on?
Yes, I mean, we have a service where people do exactly what you're describing. And I love your first idea, by the way. And I think that when you ask people to value their privacy, it turns out that they value it very highly. And so the traditional form of thinking about this was that statement's not true because you see how quickly people exchange their privacy in the form of for something free. But if you make explicit what they're actually exchanging, you find that they're willing to up the ante. And so there are two models that I think are really relevant for this. One is the ability to come behind, and your question was actually great, understand that profile and then pay to make it private, basically. So I want to go back and erase the footprint I've created. The other is, and that's what we do, by the way, and the other is this evolving sense that maybe you put yourself up kind of in the marketplace. And so you say, my information is worth X. Who wants to come bid on the ability to talk to me about whatever? And it's a new idea. I kind of like it, but I don't know if it's going to catch on.
Consumers love free. That's for sure. And we had an element of the research we did around this one we released today that showed that people are really unwilling to pay for a lot of these services. They expect them to be free, whether they completely understand that there's got to be an ad-funded model behind that or not. But I think that one of the challenges of that approach is that it's fine for targeted services like yours and that, but it doesn't scale. When you think of the 20 or 100 websites that I use that are ad-funded, and now if I'm privacy-centric and I really want to have a $1 subscription per month for each, then it's just too much for me to manage. So I think the problem is that some of these things are very piecemeal, and the consumer's not really going to enter into a financial contractual thing. They're identifying themselves as well because they're going to provide credit card details and all the rest of it, whereas they might be using the site relatively anonymously. So I wonder if it might actually have the inverse effect on privacy if we go that way.
I understand your point. I think it actually does scale very well. The challenge that you have to get you have to get companies to come into agreement on a compact with one or a few service providers. So you're not making it the onus on the consumer to do it. And there is a precedent for this. Somebody mentioned the do not call list. I was astonished when I read this. 73% of U.S. households are on the do not call list. 73% of people in the United States don't vote. But 73% of the people are on the do not call list, which shows that people care about this and they are willing to take an action if they think it can be propagated.
I think it's fundamentally different to say, I don't want people calling me during dinner time, than I want to change the entire economic underpinning of the web as we know it today. Tens of billions of dollars, tens of thousands of jobs. Let's try charging for Facebook for one day and see how that goes over, right? So I mean, I think this actually, in terms of charging people, I think it's a little bit naive to think that's gonna scale. I do think people appreciate the service that are being provided. This stuff is supporting the free internet as we know it today. Again, we've got a state legislator here today. Tens of billions of dollars are being made, and these companies are paying their taxes, and they're creating jobs out there, right?
Wait a second. The identity theft industry is
that I think was actually missing in large part from the FTC report was what are the economic implications of the things that we're suggesting here today? And by the way, why should he get to surf for free, but I have to pay for it? Why should he get the same level of service? And you're welcome, maybe you should just start a do not visit list. You're welcome to not use these services, right? My girlfriend wouldn't touch Loopt with a 10-foot pole. She doesn't have any interest in my knowing where she is, right? So consumers are welcome to not use these services, right? But at the end of the day, hundreds of millions of them are, and we're paying for them with advertising that's relevant to their interest, and I think getting better over time, and there's a really cool value exchange that's starting to happen for that, beyond just providing the services, we're returning advertising into value itself.
So that is one of the, please, those were very good comments. But that is one of the issues that we're looking for feedback on is, what are the economic implications of things like this? Is do not track is saying allowing consumers to have a choice about being tracked across different websites. Is that going to undermine your ability to serve ads for them on your site? Because that's not, serving ads on your own site is not going to be undermined by do not track. But giving information about your visitors to ad networks that can then track them across, a multitude of other sites that they visit would potentially be impacted by consumer choices.
I mean, I do think what you're seeing also now is a trend in business to recognize this is very strategic, valuable data, right? And so I think people are generally becoming a little bit more hesitant to hand it over to third parties to help them monetize. I mean, that was a huge trend back in the mid to late 90s, but I think these days they're saying, wait a second, if I can actually proxy this for my users and present advertisements and opportunities, cool coupons, rewards to them, I can create value there. I don't have to give away their data. And by the way, I don't want to give away their data because it's got value. It's got serious value for our company.
So at the beginning of the conversation tonight, I asked you all for your biggest concern about location privacy. And so now as we look to wrap up the conversation, what I'd love to do is go back on down the line and ask you if we were having the same conversation 5 years from now, what is the conversation we would be having? What are your predictions for 5 years from now? How do you expect or how do you hope the conversation will have changed in 5 years?
Yeah, so I can speak aspirationally much more easily than the crystal ball kind of situation. But I mean, I would hope that in 5 years there will be some established uniformity. There will be some effective way to communicate. Consumers are relying increasingly on mobile devices as their computers. More consumers have mobile devices than have other kinds of computers, and I would hope we'll get to a point where there is a shared understanding about what consumers can expect to happen to their data when they use mobile services.
Great, thank you.
I think 5 years from now, it is possible that we could have a federal baseline privacy law, and it's possible that it could provide, hit the sweet spot of baseline protection, but with the flexibility needed to support innovation. And you see the hints in both the FTC report and the Commerce Department report about this almost co-regulatory approach. The concept of privacy operates pretty well at the highest level across sectors, but then once you get to every sector, there are different uses for the information, and those sectors have to figure that out for themselves. It's very hard to write those rules. So I think 5 years from now, location is here to stay, clearly. I think the advertising-based model is here to stay. I think that the dominant trends in terms of storage and location-based services, we see the cloud. That's where things are going. I think that if people are willing to accept good enough instead of the perfect, we can develop some better understanding of these privacy issues and some clearer rules. So I'm relatively optimistic. Getting anything through Congress is really, really hard, and blocking stuff is really, really easy. But I think consumers want it. I think they feel they need some kind of baseline.
I think Brendon touched on this. We didn't talk enough today about the business opportunities and the opportunities for consumers and the value that we can create. So, we ran this really cool promotion with Virgin America. It was an amazing marketer. We were blessed to be connected with them. They opened up their routes to Cancun, a couple routes to Mexico, and if you went and checked in at SFO or LAX or a couple of taco trucks in those cities respectively, you got a free companion ticket. And it was a flash mob reward, so it was only announced that morning. You had 4-hour window to go get this reward. You could bring your friends. There was a bride that brought her own wedding party, and she got a bunch of companion tickets. And it was a huge success across the board. And the consumers loved it, and Virgin America was very happy, and we filled a bunch of planes. And that's just one example where we can create large business, where we can connect large businesses and brands to consumers in really exciting, interesting ways. I think there are some huge, huge opportunities for small businesses to connect with their customers like they never have before. And as we well know, small businesses drive the economy here in terms of jobs and economic growth, right? And so I think never before have you been able to get this high touch, right? You buy your Yellow Pages ad, you fax in that order once a year, and that's the extent of your small business marketing, where I think these location services are really opening up the chance for one-to-one type marketing with your local consumers. So I hope we're talking more about the opportunities for small businesses and users and value creation.
I think if we look back on this in 5 years, we'll probably think, wow, we were naive. We were just talking about this little old thing called location-based data, and Now everything we've got has either got an RFID tag or an IP address or both, and it's in our home and you know, all that sort of stuff, and it's a much bigger issue. But that's the negative side of it. I think from a hope, I would think around that industry has proven time and again as all these new innovations come along that it can step up and actually have a robust self-regulatory model in which is trusted, fits within the framework of you know, broad legislation that stands the test of time, and at the same time really provides meaningful protections to users. And back to where I began this, that scenario I painted at the beginning wouldn't happen because people are going into these data exchanges with their eyes wide open and making truly informed decisions.
I'm hopeful, and I'm going to make my hope known in two clear predictions I have for the future. The first is, all things equal, the company that's going to want to win in the next few years is going to have the better privacy model. Privacy can be a competitive advantage, and you can win on it, and you shouldn't be afraid of it. And that might be my charge also to all of you, that don't be afraid of this, because if you make it clear and you make it a choice to your customers, you might find that they're a lot more loyal and there's higher affinity there. The second prediction is there will be, much to the chagrin of my esteemed colleague Brian, there will be a very large privacy company, or maybe a few, to help manage these choices for people, because we are creating a ton of data and that data is not going away, and consumers want to have a right to control. So you will see a large industry. That industry is being hatched today in this area, in this state, but there will be multiple players, and I'm very hopeful about that.
Great. Well, thank you so much to the panelists. This was a really interesting discussion. I know I learned a lot, and I hope it was as interesting to all of you in the audience. And I think with that, I will turn it back over to Karen.
Owen, Brendon, Jim, Brian, Laura, Melissa, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and your contributions to this important conversation. Thank you in the audience for participating. And thanks for our speakers. And Melissa, we have for each of you your very own Churchill Club t-shirt. Please enjoy that. And thanks again to our program partner and sponsor, Microsoft Trustworthy Computing. If you want more information about our topic tonight, or if you didn't get a chance to watch the video that was playing during the reception, Microsoft has put together a number of pieces that can assist you as you think about privacy and location-based services. So for that, you can visit microsoft.com/privacy/DPD. And also, if you would, Melissa Parrish has a recent report that she would like to offer you as well. It is called Location-Based Social Network, so a piece of what we're talking about tonight, a hint of mobile engagement emerges. And it's based on a Forrester survey of more than 40,000 US consumers. If you're interested in this, take your business card, write the word yes on the back, and turn it in at the registration desk, and we'll make sure that that gets sent to you through Melissa. So that's a wrap. A recording of this program will be available shortly through the Churchill Club YouTube channel and also on Fora TV. Thanks to all of you for coming, and good night.